All right, so today I'll be talking about measurements, three of the most important measurement ratios that I use to track my own personal growth and what I use for my clients too. So when it comes to measurements, why even take measurements in the first place? Well, the reason why I'm such a huge advocate and such a huge fan of measurements these days is because without tracking measurements and setting target goal measurements, it's very easy to get sucked into chasing performance a little bit too much and using that as your primary means of measuring your growth. When you bias that aspect of measuring progress so much, it's easy to forget your goals as a bodybuilder. So using measurements to also measure progress, arguably to use it as your number one method of tracking growth, it reels you in a little bit and it keeps that bodybuilding mentality in check in a few different ways. And what I mean by this is if you took the people that give out that arm advice, like just do chin-ups and dips and your arms they'll grow, they'll be huge. If I was to tell one of those people, well, okay, fair enough. If you do that, that works and I'll copy that. But we're going to measure our arms every single month and actually detect what the growth is over time. I guarantee you that person changes their philosophy. I'm not saying that can't work for anybody, but for the vast majority of people, training the muscle that you're trying to grow directly and intelligently is going to be key to get it to grow. So what are these three different measurements and measurement methods that I like to use that I want you guys to be using as well? The first one is a very simple one. It's just measure your arms. And there's a few reasons why I advocate to measure your arms. And the first one is arms are the best measurement to take in my opinion. They're typically the leanest muscle group in your body. They're also a high priority for most bodybuilders. They also have a clear and defined peak. So when you take muscles like your quads or your shoulders or even your torso, like your lats and your chest, these all have a little bit of a gray area with them that have some room for error. The arms have the least room for error in my opinion because one, they're the least affected by water weight and body fat because they're generally the leanest. They also have a very clearly defined peak versus something like your quad where most people's quads are going to be cone shaped. You have no clear peak. It's always just going to be your super upper thigh and you're basically taking like a glute adductor kind of quad, kind of hamstring measurement. So that's where it gets to be a little bit tricky. Something like your arms, they actually have a peak. They also don't hold a ton of fat, and the fat variability isn't a whole ton in most people's cut and bulk cycles. So it's a clean cut, easy way to take a consistent, proper measurement. On top of that, they're obviously a high priority for most people. So of course, it's a muscle you should be checking up on anyways if you are a bodybuilder. The insight into your arm growth usually correlates with everything else too. Once you know what works for your arm growth, you can audit the rest of your training and make sure you're applying the same principles across the board. So if I know for myself, X amount of volume and X resistance profile and this much variety at this much frequency works for my arms, I can assume those principles will work for most other muscle groups. And if another muscle group isn't growing at the same rate of my arms or it's not growing at all, I guarantee you kind of copy and pasting those same fundamentals to the rest of your training will do a lot better than maybe what you're currently doing. I'm not saying every muscle group is going to be needed to be trained the exact same way with the same exact frequency, same exact volume, and same amount of variety and whatnot, but it gets you pretty close to maybe knowing what's right. And then from there, you're a massive step closer to discovering maybe what does work really well. So you can learn a lot just from arm training. It's also very straightforward too because you train your arms through isolation. So you know what muscle you're training. Nothing else is being taken over. It's a very simple way to get a good insight into your training and your programming. Measurement number 2. This is a ratio more than a measurement itself. So this is going to be the arm to waist ratio. This is a quick insight into net muscle gain rather than total mass gain, including fat and water. This is also typically best done in the same diet phase, so water weight is less of a variable. So for example, if I'm mid-bulk and my waist is 32 inches and my arms are 17 inches, random numbers, when I come back down on a cut and I look at those same measurements, the water weight could obviously be a little bit different since on a bulk you retain more, on a cut you retain less, etc. Measurement ratio number 3, and I will give examples so I can expand upon both of these points, but these are very similar, so I'm going to touch on them at the same time. Measurement number 3, arm to body weight ratio will be this final one. So to go back to the initial one, the arm to waist ratio, let me put an example up on the screen for you. So let's say this person, their starting stats, they have a 32-inch waist and 15-inch arms. Let's say they get to peak bulk a few months down the road. These are random months, random time frames. Don't take these too literally. At peak bulk, let's say they get up to a 34.5-inch waist, but their arms are at 16 inches. There's a couple issues with this. One, their arms are up an inch, so you can assume that they did grow muscle. But how much of that was muscle? We have no idea. Is this someone that disproportionately gains a bunch of fat in their arms, so their arm growth is actually very little, if any? Is this someone that stores no fat in their arms and they basically just gained all their fat around their waist and they actually did put almost a full inch on their arms? Or is this someone that just gains fat relatively proportional around their body and they made pretty good arm progress, but you can't quite tell because your body weight and your waist measurements are fluctuating? The best way to figure this out is going from the short-term arm growth comparisons to going to the mid to long-term, comparing your arm to your waist ratio when your waist gets back to the size that it started at initially. So let's say you are mid-cut going right back down. Let's say you hit that 32-inch waist again and your arms are at 15.5 inches instead of 15 inches. This is a good arm to waist ratio, and that's a sign of progress. You added half an inch to your arms. It's up to you to be satisfied with however much growth you're seeing. Of course, this is going to be somewhat individual based on training age and priority of whatever muscle group you're growing. But I'd say in most cases, for most people, if you add half an inch to your arms on a bulk, that's pretty successful. And this is a pretty random number too. So if you're not hitting half an inch arms on your bulk and you're hitting more or less, that doesn't really matter. This is just a random example that hopefully makes sense for you guys. So the second example I have today will let us go over the arm to body weight ratio. So this will be a good arm to body weight ratio. So let's say this person, their starting stats, 15-inch arms at 175 pounds body weight. Let's say they get up to a peak bulk over a handful of months, they get up to 16-inch arms and they're at 190 pounds. So you could say, all right, well, kind of a similar situation. We don't know how much of that is muscle versus how much of that is fat. Let's say at the end of their cut, they get down to 170 pounds and they have 15-inch arms. Some people might not see the progress here, but this is good progress. It is progress because they have the same exact size arm at a lighter body weight. So assuming they lost fat in their arm and they're overall a lighter body weight, their arms should be smaller if progress wasn't actually made. But they have the same size arm, so 15 inches at an even lighter body weight. So that makes it pretty clear that their arms actually have more muscle this time around. And then let's say we go from that end of the cut into the next bulk. So let's say you're halfway through your second bulk and you get back up to 175 pounds and the person has 15.5-inch arms. Obviously, that's very good progress because you're the same exact body weight that you started with when you had 15-inch arms, and now your arms are 15.5 inches. So that's great progress. And I do just want to reiterate, these numbers are relatively random. There's nothing special about the half inch or the 170 pounds or the 190 pounds or the 32-inch waist. These are just random numbers, the first ones that came to my head, that are somewhat normal. So don't take the numbers literally, but take the examples literally. And being able to analyze and look at these ratios and these measurements lets a lot of people see progress that they might not have known was happening earlier. A lot of people get too wrapped up into performance and or technique, and they kind of blind themselves in their training and don't realize that you guys are actually growing and making good progress. So this happens a lot with my clients where they say, I'm not making any progress, like this lift is stalling or not going up as fast as it should, and my measurements aren't super high yet. Well, I tell them, look at these ratios, look at these numbers, you're making great progress, and you're not realizing it because you don't know what ratios to look at. So in my opinion, these are the 3 most useful ways to measure growth in your training as a bodybuilder. I hope this helped. If you guys have any questions, let me know. I'd love to hear your feedback and your thoughts in the comments.